You ever wonder what's become of modern Hollywood? Well, I think Quentin Tarantino may have answered that question as boldly as only he could during a conversation with Bill Maher on where filmmaking is going. I believe this conversation is the most candid that we've seen Quentin in a long time, not fearing backlash against a certain woke fervor that seems to have enveloped the movie industry. There's a lot I want to explore with this one after you watch this next clip.
One thing before we run out of time, I have to say to you, besides the great entertainment, I have always really appreciated the way you pushed back when anyone tried to stifle you, shut you up, shame you, bully you. They tried it with the last one, with Once Upon a Time in the Hollywood, some about Margot Robbie doesn't have enough lines. And you do what I wish other people would do. Instead of apologizing like a little, you say, I don't agree with your assessment.
If somebody brings up something that actually is legitimate, I'll even have a conversation with them about it because I'm actually into interesting thought and I don't have to even agree with you. Oh, but that's an interesting point.
Right.
That's an interesting point.
Honestly, I think that has more to do with the fact that he doesn't have a lot of headroom to do much else. Quentin is a very different character to the rest of Hollywood and not the kind that they like. In an industry that has taken a turn for the woke, he hasn't. And that's evident from the kind of films you see from him in the last 10 years, despite the rapid left turn that Hollywood has taken. It's the resurrection of what modern Hollywood may call toxic masculinity in films like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Then there's films like The Hateful Eight that some people almost saw as an ode to gore and gun violence. And of course, we have seen titles like Kill Bill, one of my favorites, and my other, Pulp Fiction, in the past. And these are projects that also fall very out of line for what the modern Hollywood accepts in its themes and characters. So you can imagine that the director that it's all emanating from will probably be the firing line of the woke strand in the industry, and you'd be right. But it seems like Quentin has gotten used to that and learned that it really is a question of how much artistic integrity you want to have versus pleasing the popular crowd.
There has become a thing that's gone on, it seems like in this, especially this last year, where, what's the word I'm looking at? Ideology is more important than art.
Way more, certainly to the awards.
Yeah. And it's just, it's like, ideology trumps art. Ideology trumps individual effort. Ideology trumps good. Ideology trumps entertaining.
What is that ideology? It's the social justice crowd with their DEI policies and hyper-feminist themes that seek to revise everything that the film industry has produced and will produce next. Isn't that exactly what you see every time we see a She-Hulk in the scene twerking in an office with Megan Thee Stallion? Or Snow White, that's a strong independent woman that has no prince to fall in love with, which, by the way, is what we'll be seeing in the Disney reboot. All in all, the audience has started to realize that this ideology is an altar on which Hollywood is sacrificing everything, and it's only a matter of time where people grow tired of being lectured when they come to be entertained. That's not too far-fetched to imagine, because I think we may be seeing a resurgence for the kind of edgy and unconventional filmmaking that characterizes Quentin Tarantino, as people finally see something different that they choose to watch. Though it has to be said, Quentin is just a part of a much bigger counterwave in the industry at large. Hollywood goes through cycles around its censorship and content style that we've seen before.
Are you bullish on the future of movies? Because
well, look, you have to always look at.
Are we going to get back to that place?
Look, this happened. This comes in waves. This absolutely comes in waves. All right, so it's like, okay, just looking at the 40s. All right, that was during the wartime, but that's also the time that you had film noir, where you actually, even though with the Hays Code, you had these dark, dark stories that were being told. But then after the war was won, then you had the 50s, which was the first of the completely homogenized decades, where you couldn't say shit if you had a mouthful, all right? And every bestseller, every play that was turned into a movie, if there was anything sexual about it or anything, that's all going to be drained out of the movie. It's going to be weaned out of the movie. It's just the way it is. And then to me, it's one of the worst decades in Hollywood is the 50s. And the 60s, pretty much from like 1960 to 1966, was the 50s part 2.
Maybe not in the exact content, but the current era is awfully similar to that one in terms of the industry self-censoring on certain accepted topics. The 50s were a time of great euphoria in post-war America and an optimism that bled onto the film industry, But at the same time, the memories of the war were still fresh, and there were certain ideas by an unspoken rule that just had to be censored. Any left-wing idea, any sympathy to communism or social taboo were the walls that dictated what the filmmakers were allowed to do. But you know what was interesting that perhaps carries over today as well? Much of the stifling of free cinema happened from within the industry, and according to walls of political correctness of the time, in which case even ideas and film themes that advocated equal civil rights for the races were on a thin line to walk on. Endorsement of female empowerment or non-traditional gender roles were an unspoken no-go area. Today, those particular ideas may have changed, but the method remains the same. Back then, the Hays Code came from within the film industry to govern the content and themes of the films according to what the established narrative was, and it came about as a way for filmmakers to avoid government crackdown by demonstrating that they could regulate themselves. Today, the government is perhaps not as big a threat as the threat of cancellation, social isolation, and financial loss in the industry. If you don't toe a certain political and social line, you're expected to know which side of the debate to stand on when it comes to feminism, trans debate, and response to the pandemic, foreign wars like Ukraine, and breaking down old gender roles and expectations in movie plots. Quentin Tarantino sticks out like a sore thumb in an industry like this, and he's had his fair share of controversies for it.
Then what we think of as the 60s starts in about 67, and that's when New Hollywood comes out. Yeah. And that's an absolute positive response to the homogenized 50s.
So it's going to come back again.
Okay, and then it goes into the 70s, but then we went into the 80s.
All right.
And that's why you came up with politically incorrect, because that was the first, this is basically the 80s part 2, what we're living through right now.
Well, I'll just take one more go at it. There's going to be a new golden age. Please be there and part of it. All right.
I think the modern era is a bit of an interesting mix. We've got an area open for filmmakers in the form of social media and streaming platforms that should supposedly give us the greatest creative freedom that we've ever had. And yet, the same technologies are empowering the societal forces to clamp down on that creative freedom through the threats of cancellation and censorship. In other words, the same thing that should free us in reinforcing the chains that bound the industry in the past. It's sad because clearly the audience is hungry as ever for the kind of unfiltered and authentic films it was used to in the 80s and 90s. Modern Hollywood may not understand it, but the audience is actually much smarter and tougher than they give them credit for. People can digest controversial themes, difficult concepts, and unconventional plot lines. And if it's not the mainstream industry that's feeding that need, it's inevitably going to give rise to an alternative industry that caters to that need. Though Quentin Tarantino is still very much a part of the mainstream, the fact that he's still as big as he is despite not being an industry favorite tells a lot about where the audience really stands.